She heard him before she saw him. That was the precise order of it, and it mattered. She had learned, in the 3 months since she had come to Ashwell Park as a maid-of-all-work, that most of what mattered in a great house arrived before you were ready for it. The housekeeper's footstep on the back stair, the bell that pulled you from sleep, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel when you had not yet finished laying the fires. Sound was the thing you could not control or correct. You could smooth your apron and straighten your cap and arrange your face into its working expression of steady, serviceable calm. You could not unhear a voice. She was in the passage between the still room and the servants' hall, carrying a jug of warmed cider to the laundrywomen. When the sound came through the closed baize door at the passage's far end, a single sentence. Nothing notable in the sentence itself. It was a courtesy, a brief remark to the butler, something about the state of the road from Stourport. The voice was not loud. It was, in fact, quite controlled. A man accustomed to being heard without raising his tone. Cecily Drummond stopped walking. The cider sloshed against the lip of the jug. A single warm drop landed on her wrist, and she stood in the dim passage and did not wipe it away, because her hands had stopped functioning in quite the ordinary manner. And she was certain, entirely certain, in the wordless way the body knows what the mind has not yet admitted, that the voice belonged to the Marquis of Eltham. Not the old Marquis. The old Marquis was dead. She knew that better than most. This was the son. If someone had asked Cecily later what she felt in that passage, she would have had difficulty answering honestly, because the sensation was not one thing. It was not grief alone, though grief was there, cold and familiar, the way a healed bone aches in winter. It was not rage alone, though that was present too, quiet and deliberate beneath the grief. Something she had learned to carry with both hands because it was heavy, and because it could not be set down. It was the particular compound feeling of recognizing an enemy in a place where you have no standing to call anyone an enemy. She was a maid. He was a marquis. She had a jug of cider and a list of tasks that ran to supper, and the man whose name had been on every document that reduced her family to nothing was in the front hall of the house where she now earned her wages by hauling grates and blacking boots. She breathed in through her nose, slowly, and walked to the laundry. The laundrywomen thanked her. She nodded and said it was no trouble. She went back to the morning room and polished the fireplace tools until they threw back her own reflection, and she made herself think about each tool as she worked it, its weight and its surface, and the correct motion of the cloth. And she did not think about the voice. She almost managed it. The laundry copper was full, and the women were in good spirits. And one of them, a broad, cheerful woman named Bridget, who had worked at Ashwell Park for 11 years, told a story about a footman and a cat that made the others laugh. And Cecily listened and smiled at the right moments and folded a linen sheet that did not need folding, because her hands needed to do something that had a clear beginning and a clear end. The sheet was warm from the copper, and it smelled of plain soap and hard water, and she concentrated on the weight of it, the way the warmth moved through her palms, and she did not think about the passage. Bridget said, to no one in particular, that they had heard the great man himself had arrived, the Marquis of Eltham, staying 3 nights on account of wanting a look at the Grange. One of the younger girls said she had seen him from the back stair window, and he was handsome in a dark way. Not easy-looking, more like a man who thought too much. Cecily said, "Have you finished with the blue pillowcases?" The girl said yes and handed them over, and the conversation moved on, and Cecily continued folding things that did not need folding. His name was Edmund Vane, the Marquis of Eltham. He had inherited 3 years ago, at 26, and by all the accounts she had heard since his arrival in the neighborhood, the other maids talked and Cecily listened, because servants always knew before the newspapers he was not much like his father. His father had been a man of loud opinions and easy cruelties, a man who bought debts because buying debts was a kind of collecting, who had held the mortgage on Drummond Hall for 11 years and called it in the winter Cecily's father died, so that she and her mother were turned out of the house her grandfather had built into the cold and the particular social limbo of gentlewomen who no longer had a home to be gentlewomen in. Edmund Vane had been a young man then. Perhaps he had not known the particulars. She had told herself this, in the early weeks after, when she needed something to hold on to that was not pure fury. She had believed it for about as long as she had believed other useful fictions. A month, perhaps. She did not believe it now. She knew because she had been 19 when the first letter came from the Vane solicitor. She had been in the kitchen garden with her father, helping him stake the bean rows in the early summer of that year, and her mother had come out with the letter still in her hand, and her face arranged into the particular careful expression it always had when she was frightened and would not say so. Her father had taken the letter, read it slowly, refolded it along its own lines, and put it into his coat pocket. And he had gone back to the staking. And he had not spoken of it until dinner. When he did speak of it, his voice was quite steady. He said that the terms would require some attention, and that he had written to his own man of business, and that there was no immediate cause for alarm. Cecily had watched her mother's face across the table, and had thought, for the first time, that some particular kind of safety that she had not previously identified as a specific thing had become suddenly visible to her by being threatened. That feeling had taken 3 years to fully materialize into fact. 3 years of letters and partial payments, and one meeting her father had taken alone in Shrewsbury, that he had returned from quieter than he had left. 3 years that ended in the November that her father's heart gave out, 2 weeks before the calling-in notice arrived. And she had often thought since then that the sequencing was somehow crueler than either event alone, that he had not been spared the knowledge of what was coming, only spared the moment of its arrival. He was here to look at the neighboring estate, Alderton Grange, which was currently being offered for sale, and which he had apparently expressed some interest in acquiring. The housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, made this known at the servants' table that evening with the particular satisfaction of a woman who likes to demonstrate that she possesses information before anyone else. He would be staying 3 nights. He would require the red guest room, the use of the small study, and his man to have the room off the upper landing. He had no other requirements except that his morning coffee be sent up sharp at 7, and that no one disturb him in the study between the hours of 10 and 1. 3 nights, Cecily thought. She had managed worse things than 3 nights. She was wrong about that, but she did not yet know it. The second morning, she was polishing the mirror in the upper corridor when he came out of the guest suite. She heard the door before she saw him, and she had just enough time to turn her face toward the glass and make herself invisible in the particular way a woman in her position learned to be invisible, which was not the same as hiding. It was more like stillness, like becoming part of the furniture until someone looked past you. He did not look past her. She heard him stop. She kept the cloth moving on the glass. She watched his reflection watch her, and she did not understand, for a moment, what he was doing. Because the men who stayed in great houses generally managed the servants by not seeing them at all, which was the most efficient system, and the one she had come to rely upon. He said, his voice entirely level, "You have missed a streak there, to the right." She looked. There was a streak, a long diagonal one she had somehow passed over. She corrected it. "Thank you, sir," she said. That was all. She did not look at him directly. She went back to the mirror. She heard him take one step, pause, take another, and go. She did not know what to make of it. She decided not to try. That afternoon she was sent to the small study to replenish the coal. She knocked. She heard nothing, and Mrs. Poole had instructed her the study would be empty until 4, so she went in, and he was there, at the writing desk, and he looked up when the door opened. He did not look irritated. She had no good word for what he looked. He looked at her as though she was a question he had not expected the house to put to him. She said, "I beg your pardon, my lord. I was told the room would be empty until 4. He said, "It is 3:30. She said, "Yes, my lord." She hesitated at the door. "I will come back." "There is no need," he said. He returned to his papers. She crossed to the coal scuttle. She worked quietly, setting the coal with the deliberation of someone who knows she is being watched and has decided to give no evidence of knowing it. When she had finished, she straightened and turned to go, and he said, without looking up from his papers, "What is your name?" She told him. She did not think about it beforehand. One does not think about giving one's name when asked. It is the kind of reflexive response that social training produces, like saying good morning to a person you dislike on a public street. "Miss Drummond," he said. He set his pen down. She stopped. He looked at her then, and the look on his face was not the look she had expected, which was nothing, or at most polite neutrality. It was something more concentrated than that. Not cruel. Not satisfied. Not the look of a man who owns a small triumph. Something more difficult to categorize. "You may go," he said. She went. The passage outside the study was cold, the kind of cold that came through stone walls in November, regardless of how well the fires were laid, and she stood in it for a moment with her hand at her side, and her breathing very deliberate. She had a lamp. She had walked in with the lamp, and walked out with it, and its light made a small moving circle around her feet as she stood in the corridor doing nothing, which was something a maid had no business doing in the middle of the afternoon. From somewhere below her she could hear the kitchen sounds, the particular rhythm of a great house in the late morning, knives on boards and a door swinging, and someone's voice giving an instruction she could not make out. She walked. She sat in the still room afterwards, alone, because she needed a moment that had no one in it. Her hands were completely steady. She noted this with the distant pride of someone who has trained herself for a long time. She thought about his face when she said her name, and she thought about his father's name on the papers the solicitor had shown her mother. And she thought about the 3 nights that had become now 2. And she decided that she would not tell anyone her suspicion, because there was nothing to tell and nothing to gain, and no outcome available to a woman in her position that was worth the cost of a scene. What she did not yet know was that he was thinking the same name she was, that he had been thinking it, in fact, since the previous morning in the corridor, when something in the angle of her face had struck him as familiar in a way he could not account for. And he had gone back to the Drummond papers that evening, the papers his father had kept, and that he had inherited with everything else he had not wanted. And he had found her name in the margin of a letter his father had written 11 years ago to the solicitor who handled the calling in. A name in a margin. That was all she was, in the Vane family's accounting. He found it did not sit comfortably. He was a man who had spent 3 years trying to understand what he had inherited, which was not only land and title and the machinery of a great estate, but also the residue of his father's decisions, the small and large cruelties that had built the Vane fortune through accumulation, through the collection of other people's necessities. He had known in the abstract that his father had held mortgages. He had known, in the abstract, that mortgages were called in. He had not known, until he sat in that candlelit study with the account spread before him, that the woman polishing the mirror above him had been 21 years old when her father died, and the house was taken. That she had a mother in Shrewsbury now living on the charity of a sister. That she had come to work in service because there was nothing else. That she had done so without, as far as any record showed, making any public complaint or taking any action that was not simply the steady continuation of a dignified life. He had sat with that for a long time. The third morning, she was at the servants' breakfast when Mrs. Poole came in with a particular expression, the expression that meant something had changed in the house's order, and she was not yet certain whether it was above or below her authority. She said that his lordship had asked for Miss Drummond to bring his morning coffee, not one of the other girls, Miss Drummond specifically. There was a silence at the table. Cecily felt it, the particular quality of attention that women in service direct at a colleague when something unusual has been requested. Attention that was not malice, but was not exactly without sharpness either. She said, "Very well," and went to the kitchen for the tray. She carried it up herself. She knocked at the door of the red guest room, and he said, "Come in," and she went in. And he was dressed, standing at the window, looking out at the November park. He did not turn around immediately. She set the tray down on the small table by the fire and waited to be dismissed. He said, "How long have you been at Ashwell Park?" She said, "3 months, my lord." He said, "And before that?" She said, "I was at a house in Hereford. Before that, Cheltenham." She kept her voice entirely pleasant and entirely unrevealing. It was a skill she had been perfecting for some time. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the same quality of attention she had noticed in the study, the concentrated, uncomfortable attention that did not feel dismissive or triumphant, that she did not know what to do with. He said, "Miss Drummond, my father held the mortgage on Drummond Hall." There it was. She held herself very still. It was not difficult. She had been holding herself still through hard things for a long time now, and this was harder than most of them. But the skill did not care about difficulty. She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "I have been looking at the Drummond accounts." She said nothing. The property was sold at a figure below its value, he said. My father's solicitor made a purchase on behalf of a holding concern. The holding concern is mine now, along with everything else. She thought about the pasture behind the house where she had learned to ride. She thought about the window of her childhood bedroom and the quality of light through it in early summer. She thought about her father's face the last time she had seen him well, before the illness that killed him inside of 6 weeks and left them undefended. She said, "I see, my lord." "I do not think," he said slowly, as though the words were being assembled with care, "that what happened was as it should have been." She looked at him then. She had not meant to, not directly, not with the full unguarded weight of what she was looking with. But she did, and he did not look away. She said, "No?" It was the most honest thing she had said in 3 months, perhaps longer. He said, "I would like to discuss what is owed." She said, "My lord, I am a maid in this house. I have duties. I am not in a position to discuss anything with you." He said, "I am aware of the disparity." She said, "Are you?" It was not a question. It was something between a statement and a challenge, and she heard herself say it, and she felt the edge of it leave her mouth, and she waited for the quality of the room to change the way a room changes when a servant has overstepped. It did not change. He said, "Yes." He said it quietly. I am also aware that awareness of a disparity and the power to do something about it are, in this world, more unevenly distributed than they should be. I am not asking you to solve that. I am asking you to listen to a proposal, she said. I beg your pardon? A legal proposal, he said, and she saw, very briefly, something almost like discomfort cross his face, which was lean and serious, with the particular controlled quality of a man who did not allow himself much expression in public. About the property. There are means within the law by which a wrong of this kind can be addressed. Not fully. Nothing can address it fully. There are options I have the ability to pursue, and I am prepared to pursue them, and I would like your instruction on how to proceed. If it had been a different man, in a different room, after a different 3 years, she might have laughed. Not unkindly. She had spent 3 years watching the men who had the ability to do things not pursue those abilities, and she had come to think that power and intention, in a man, were very seldom the same thing. He must have seen something of this in her face, because he said, with a directness she did not expect, I know I have no claim to your trust. I am not asking for trust. I am asking for an appointment with your solicitor and your instruction on what outcome you would find acceptable. I will do the rest. She looked at him for a long time. She said, Why? He said, Because it was wrong. She said, It was wrong when it happened. Yes, he said. She said, Your father knew it was wrong. I believe he did, Edmund Vane said, and his voice was very quiet, and she heard in it something she had not expected, which was not guilt exactly, because guilt is a man's feeling about his own actions, but something adjacent to it, something a man feels when he has looked clearly at what was done in his name and by his blood, and has decided he is not willing to pretend it was simply the way of things. She said, I will want a proper accounting of the estate's sale value and the amount the holding concern paid for it. He said, I can have that produced by the end of the week. She said, and I will want my mother's situation considered in any arrangement. She has lived 3 years in my aunt's house. That cannot be undone, but it ought to be accounted for. Agreed, he said. She stood in the red guest room of Ashwell Park in her working apron with her hands at her sides, and she thought about the passage the day before yesterday, about the cider jug and the voice, and the 3 nights she had been so certain she could manage. She thought about her father's handwriting on the letters she still kept in the bottom of her trunk, letters that talked about the land as though it were a living thing, as though the pasture and the kitchen garden and the old apple orchard were members of the family. She thought about her own name in the margin of a letter she had never seen. She said, This does not alter what was done. He said, No, it does not. She said, I want that understood. He said, It is. She picked up the empty tray, for he had not touched the coffee, and she went to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. He said, Miss Drummond. She waited. He said, What you have managed these 3 years is not something that ought to have been required of you. She did not look at him. She said, No, it is not. She went downstairs, and she put the tray in the kitchen, and she went to the linen room, which was narrow and dim and smelled of dried lavender and warm cotton, and she sat down on the single stool there, and she pressed her hands flat against her knees, and she breathed. She was not weeping. She was very close to it, but it was not the weeping of a woman who has been broken. It was the different kind of weeping, the kind that comes when something that has been held rigid for a very long time is permitted, briefly, to soften. She had been carrying the weight of what was owed to her for so long that she had stopped thinking of it as a weight. She had simply moved around it, day after day, and called the moving around it a life. She sat in the linen room for 6 minutes by the small clock on the shelf. The clock was a plain one, worn brass, the kind that had been in servants' rooms for decades. It ticked with the indifferent steadiness of a thing that did not care what was happening around it. She listened to it. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and listened to it, and felt, very slowly, the rigid thing inside her chest begin to become something slightly less rigid. Not soft. She was not going to be soft about this, because soft did not survive what she had been through, and she was not interested in ceasing to survive. Less rigid. The difference between iron and cold stone is not much from the outside, but from the inside. From the place where the thing is being held. It is a significant difference. She thought about his face when he said that what had happened was not as it should have been. She thought about the plainness of it, the absence of apology that would have required her to accept or refuse it, and made the whole encounter about his feeling, rather than her situation. He had not apologized. He had stated a fact. She recognized the distinction because she had been applying it to her own life for 3 years. The distinction between what one felt and what was true. And she had found the truth a great deal more useful to stand on than the feeling. She did not know what to do with a man who appeared to know the same distinction. She stood and straightened her apron and went back to work. The meeting with the solicitors took place in Shrewsbury in January, in a room above a printer's shop that smelled of ink and coal smoke and the particular dusty warmth of old documents. She and her mother had come from the cottage at Church Stretton on the early coach, arriving before the town had properly woken, and they had sat together in a coffee house until the appointed hour, and her mother had talked about the sisters' garden and the state of the Shrewsbury roads, and things that had nothing to do with the reason they were there, because her mother had always managed difficult things by talking about something else entirely, until the difficult thing was directly in front of her. Cecily had listened, and drunk her coffee, and watched her mother's hands around the cup. The rings she still wore, though the house they had lived in when she first put them on was gone. Barwick's room was on the 2nd floor, reached by a narrow stair that creaked at every step. He was a careful, gray-haired man of 60 or so, with spectacles on a ribbon, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years being precise. He offered them chairs. He poured tea that no one drank. Cecily's mother sat beside her and held her hand through the initial reading, and when the accountant's summary was placed before them, a careful line-by-line comparison of the Drummond Hall estate valuation in 18 and 12 against the price actually paid by the Vane holding concern, her mother closed her eyes and breathed very carefully, and Cecily kept hers open. The difference in the figures was significant. It was not, in the final accounting, reversible. The house itself had passed through 2 subsequent sales. The monetary disparity was real and calculable, and Edmund Vane had prepared a settlement document that addressed not only the principal difference, but the 3 years of rental value her family had been unable to collect on the pasture land, which had been let at a profitable rate since the sale. He was not present at the first meeting. He had sent his solicitor, a careful gray-haired man named Barwick, who answered every question with a precision that suggested he had been instructed to answer fully and conceal nothing. Cecily asked her questions. Her mother asked hers. Barwick answered. At the end of the meeting, when they were putting on their coats, Barwick said, as though it were a small matter and not a large one, that Lord Eltham had asked to know if there was anything further that had been omitted from the accounting. Any other matter the Drummond family felt ought to be considered. He said Lord Eltham had been, in Barwick's 30 years of practice, unusual in this particular insistence. Cecily's mother said softly, "What other matters might there be?" Cecily said. There was one. She asked Barwick to convey to Lord Eltham that her father had spent the last year of his life attempting to address the mortgage situation, and had been, in every instance, refused an extension of terms. She did not know whether this had been deliberate policy or mere administrative indifference, but she felt it ought to be part of the record. Barwick wrote it down. She did not meet Edmund Vane again until March, when the settlement had been completed in its legal essentials and she had left her position at Ashwell Park, having given proper notice, having thanked Mrs. Poole and said her goodbyes to the laundrywomen and the kitchen girls, and having moved into the small cottage in Church Stretton that was part of the settlement's practical arrangements. It was not Drummond Hall. It was not 300 acres and the old apple orchard and her grandfather's handwriting on the gate posts. It was a cottage with 4 rooms and a garden that faced south, and a view of the Long Mynd that on certain mornings, in the right light, could stop her breathing for entirely the right reasons. He came in March, on a Thursday, without announcement beyond a letter sent 2 days prior, asking if he might call. The letter was formal and short, and used exactly the right amount of courtesy for the circumstances, which she had noticed was characteristic of him. She wrote back with permission. He came in the afternoon, when the light was low and golden in the way that late March light is in the Welsh borders, warm and slightly amber, making ordinary things look briefly significant. She let him in herself, because she had not yet hired anyone, and she brought him into the sitting room, and they sat across from one another at the small table she had placed near the window. The cottage was plain, and she had done little to it yet, because there had not been time, and also because she was not yet entirely certain she believed in it, in the particular way one does not fully believe in a thing that has been recovered after being lost for a long time. The sitting room had a good fireplace and a window that looked into the garden, and the chair she had placed opposite it was her own, brought from her mother's house in the last arrangement, a worn wing-backed chair with green upholstery rubbed through at the arm. She had given him the newer chair. She sat in the green one and folded her hands in her lap, and waited. He had brought nothing except himself. He was not in traveling clothes, but in ordinary morning dress, dark coat, white linen, the clothing of a man who had ridden rather than come by carriage, and there was mud on his boots that he had been careful enough about to leave most of it at the door, but not quite careful enough about to eliminate entirely. She noticed the mud. She thought it was the most ordinary thing about him she had seen. The mud on his boots, the evidence of an actual road between wherever he had come from and here. He asked whether the cottage was adequate. She said it was more than adequate. She said, "The garden wants work. I have been looking forward to the work." He said, "I used to help with my mother's garden when I was a boy, before she died." He paused. "I mention it only because I understand the particular satisfaction of a thing that grows, because you have helped it grow." She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the view of the hill, with an expression that was not comfortable exactly, but was not guarded either. She thought he was a man who had learned to hold difficult things without displaying them, and was, in this room, in this particular afternoon light, not working quite as hard at the holding as he usually did. She said, "How old were you?" He said, 9. He paused. "My father was not the grieving kind. He did not grieve visibly. It was considered a mark of good character." She thought about that. She thought about a 9-year-old boy in a great house with a father who did not grieve visibly, and then she thought about a man of 26 who inherited, along with land and title, a set of accounts that told him something about the family he had come from. And she thought about what a person does with that information when there is no one to grieve it with, and the world outside considers it simply the way of things. she said. "I am sorry about your mother." He looked at her, and she saw something shift in his face, the very slight and controlled release of a thing that had been held for a long time. He said, "Thank you." They sat in the low gold light. A blackbird was singing somewhere in the garden, the long liquid phrase of it coming through the window she had opened 3 inches because the afternoon was mild. He said, "I should like, if you are willing, to call again." She said, "On what occasion?" He said, "On no particular occasion. To call." He paused. "I am aware that is not a conventional proposal of any kind. I am also aware that what I can offer you by way of context is limited. The balance of what has been between our families is not something I can ask you to set aside. I would not want you to set it aside. I find I would like the opportunity to be known to you, over time, as a person who is separate from what was done. If that is a thing you have any interest in." She thought about the passage and the cider jug. She thought about a voice she had recognized before she had a face to put it to, and the months of carrying that recognition carefully, the way you carry something that might break. She thought about the solicitor's room in Shrewsbury and the figures on the page, and her mother's closed eyes. She thought about a name in a margin. She said, "I am not certain it is a thing I have interest in. I would need to discover that over time." He said, "Yes, that is what I mean." She said, "I am not an easy person to know well." He said, "I had gathered that." She said, "And I am not willing to be known in a way that requires me to pretend that everything is settled between us, because it is not. The legal aspects, perhaps. The rest is a longer accounting." He said, "I know it is." She said, "Then you may call." He stood to go. He had taken his coat from the chair and put it on, and he was standing at the door of the sitting room. And he said, "Miss Drummond?" She said, "Mr. Vane." She used his plain name deliberately. Not his title. His name. He looked at her for a moment with the concentrated, uncomfortable, unguarded attention she had grown accustomed to, the look that did not dismiss or manage her. And she thought that whatever he had come from, whatever the shape of the family he had inherited, he had somewhere inside it developed the particular and not especially common quality of wanting to see things as they were, rather than as it would be convenient for them to be. That was not nothing. He said, "You said your father spent the last year of his life trying to find a resolution." She said, "Yes." He said, "I read his correspondence. Barwick located it in the estate files." He paused. He was a man of considerable clarity and considerable dignity. His letters were carefully written. I read them with attention. I think he was a better man than the situation he was placed in. She stood very still. He said, "I thought you might want to know that someone had read them, that they existed in the record and had been read." She said, "Thank you." He left. She stood in the sitting room after the sound of his horse had faded from the lane, and she looked out at the garden that wanted work, at the south-facing view and the amber light on the hill, and she thought about her father's letters in a drawer in Barwick's office, the careful, dignified handwriting she had known all her life, recognized and read at last by someone who had not been required to read them. She thought about what it meant to be read when no one has read you. She thought about a woman in a passage with a cider jug and the particular compound sensation of recognition, and how it had changed shape across the months between that moment and this one. She was not certain what any of it would become. She was not a woman who permitted herself certainties she had not earned. She put on her coat and went out into the garden, and picked up the old fork that had come with the cottage, and began to turn the first cold bed of earth. And the blackbird, who had been watching from the apple tree at the wall, dropped down to follow her along the row, and the light lasted longer than she had expected, and she worked until it was gone. If the questions this story has raised have settled somewhere in you, leave a note below. There are others who sat with the same weight, and they are glad to know they are not alone in it. She did not know, as she latched the garden gate in the last of the March light, that he would come back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that in May he would stand in the garden with his coat off and help her lay the new beds, that in June he would say her given name, Cecily. For the first time, quietly, without occasion, as though he had been carrying it carefully and needed to set it down. She did not know that by autumn he would have said the thing that needed saying, simply and without performance, standing in the kitchen doorway with mud on his boots and his face very open and serious, and that she would have answered him with the full weight of her own careful, particular honesty. She did not know any of that. She knew the soil was cold and workable under the fork, and that the light was fading over the long mind, and that her father's letters were in a drawer in Shrewsbury, read and acknowledged and filed among the real things that had happened. That was enough. For now, it was exactly enough.